It was 2 a.m. Daniel Ross, a single father, was rocking his 7-year-old daughter Lily to sleep when a loud, violent knocking made him jump, his heart pounding. He cautiously cracked the door open. Standing on the threshold was Evelyn Carter, 32, the ruthless CEO of Carter Industries. Her expensive suit was drenched, hair disheveled, and eyes strikingly red. She whispered, her voice trembling and fragile. I didn't know where else to go." Lily stirred, peering around his leg, and softly asked, "Daddy, is the lady crying?" Evelyn looked up and a tear spilled over her cheek as Daniel met her gaze. Daniel Ross, at 35, was just another maintenance worker on the night crew for the massive Carter Industries. He was an unremarkable man, defined only by his grueling schedule, working 2 simultaneous jobs just to provide for his daughter, Lily, who was his entire world. After his wife passed away 7 years prior, Daniel had isolated himself, building a quiet, protective fortress around Lily in their tiny apartment. He was disciplined, rarely spoke, and made it his mission to be completely invisible at work. Drawing attention was dangerous. It was a luxury he couldn't afford. His boss, Evelyn Carter, existed in a completely different stratosphere. She was notorious across the entire city as the Ice Queen. A business prodigy, immensely successful, Evelyn was rarely seen outside of boardrooms and corporate jets. She never smiled, she never engaged, and she certainly never showed the slightest concern for the thousands of employees under her command. To Daniel, she was a terrifying, distant figure, a person with the absolute power to terminate his career and his stability with a single, unfeeling signature. Daniel feared her authority, but he respected her competence. He kept his head down until exactly 1 week ago, when he accidentally saw her. He had been checking a circuit breaker near the executive offices and paused outside a dark, empty conference room. Through the glass, he'd seen Evelyn sitting alone at the polished mahogany table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She had been weeping. Daniel quickly turned and walked away, pretending he hadn't seen anything at all. He had dismissed it instantly. Rich people problems, he thought. They have different kinds of stress, but it has nothing to do with me. Yet here she was now, at his door. At 2 a.m., her hair was plastered to her forehead by the rain, and the stark red of her eyes looked alien against the pale, shocked expression on her face. She looked less like a CEO and more like someone who had fled a catastrophe. Daniel slowly opened the door wider, stepping into the hall to shield his apartment's interior. "Ms. Carter, are you all right?" he asked, keeping his voice a low, hesitant whisper. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She just shuddered, a full body tremble as a sudden gust of cold wind swept down the stairwell, wrapping around her wet clothes. She clutched a pair of sodden file folders tightly against her chest, as if they were the only things tethering her to reality. Lily, woken fully now by the noise and the cold, ran out and hugged her father's leg. She looked up at the tall, shaking woman with genuine, wide-eyed concern. "Hello, ma'am," the little girl said, her voice bright and innocent. "Are you hurt somewhere?" Evelyn's head snapped down to look at the child. She stared at Lily as if the little girl were an unbelievable luxury she hadn't known existed. A living, breathing embodiment of simple, unadulterated kindness. Daniel knew he couldn't leave her standing there in the rain and the cold. It was inhuman. Ignoring the massive, professional chasm between them, he finally stepped aside. "Please, come in," he said, his voice now firm. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then crossed the threshold. As she stepped into the small, modestly furnished, and somewhat cluttered apartment, she looked around. It was not luxurious, not even comfortable by her standards, but it was undeniably warm. It was infused with the smell of cheap coffee and the unmistakable presence of deep, abiding love. Daniel moved toward the kitchen, retrieving a clean, soft dish towel. He returned and gently handed it to her. "Sit down, please," he instructed, his voice low and concerned. "You're freezing." Evelyn took the towel, but she didn't use it. She simply stared at him, her CEO mask finally stripped away. It was a look of disbelief. She couldn't comprehend that anyone would show her genuine care without expecting something massive in return. Evelyn finally sank onto the small, worn armchair, still trembling, still clutching the damp files to her chest like a shield. The silence of the small apartment, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, felt profoundly heavy. Daniel, ignoring the absurdity of the situation, the powerful CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company sitting in his cramped living room, busied himself. He heated up a kettle of water and returned, offering her a steaming mug of instant herbal tea. She accepted the mug, her hands wrapping around the warmth, but her composure finally broke. A choked sob escaped her. "I didn't want to come here, Daniel," she admitted, looking anywhere but at him. "But I truly had nowhere else to go tonight." Daniel simply nodded and remained silent. He knew better than to push. Whatever storm had brought her here, she would tell him in her own time. Lily, ever the innocent healer, returned from her room, holding out her most cherished possession, a faded, one-eyed teddy bear. She climbed up onto the sofa opposite Evelyn. "This helps me when I'm scared," Lily said, offering the bear to the CEO. "You can try it." Evelyn's gaze softened immediately, transforming her features. She took the bear, resting the plush toy gently on her lap. For the first time, she wasn't attempting to hide the raw, exposed fear in her eyes. Finally, she took a shaky breath and leaned forward, the words tumbling out, almost in a rush. "They want to overthrow me," she confessed. Daniel stiffened in his chair. He was just a maintenance man, a worker who fixed boilers and changed filters. Her world, corporate coups and internal warfare, was impossibly vast and complicated, but he listened intently. Evelyn continued, the story unfolding with the cold, precise detail of a corporate exposé. "There is a faction within the executive board," she explained, her voice gaining a desperate, sharp edge. "They've been planning a hostile takeover for months. They want the CEO chair. They manufactured evidence, Daniel. They framed me for embezzling funds from a subsidiary account. Tonight, they sent the final, fabricated documents. They tried to force me to sign them, an immediate admission of guilt and a resignation letter. I realized that if I signed, I wouldn't just lose the company. I'd lose my reputation, my security, everything I have built since I was 20. She had run. She had walked out of the building, file folders in hand, with nowhere to go because she instinctively knew her own people would be watching her residences. Daniel felt compelled to ask the logical question. "What about your family, Ms. Carter? Your support network?" Evelyn laughed, a short, painful sound that held no humor. "Family? I have no one standing on my side. They see the company as a legacy, not my success. When they saw the documents, they believed the board immediately. They were waiting for me to fail. My work, that was all I had left." A tense silence returned to the little room. The only sound was the distant city traffic. Daniel rose slowly and knelt down, carefully fixing a misplaced button on Lily's pajamas. He then looked at Evelyn, his expression calm and steady. "You can stay here tonight," he said simply. "It's not much, Mrs. Carter, but it's safe. It's a safe place." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. Here was an ordinary man, a man who worked with his hands, but his eyes held an unnerving, simple peace she had never known. Lily, already adopting the CEO as a friend, tugged on Evelyn's hand and led her toward the single small bedroom. "You sleep here, Ms. Eve," Lily instructed, pointing to a small floor futon next to her own bed. "Daddy and I will sleep on the couch, so you're comfortable." Evelyn was utterly speechless, choked by the little girl's profound, unquestioning generosity. Daniel laid out a fresh blanket, placed the mug of water beside the futon, and paused before reaching for the light switch. "Why are you helping me?" Evelyn whispered, turning to look at his shadowed figure. Daniel's answer was quiet, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Because everyone deserves someone who will believe them when they need it most." Evelyn turned her face to the wall, and the tears finally came. Not tears of fear or corporate stress, but tears of pure, breaking relief. For the first time in her adult life, someone was being kind to her, and it had absolutely nothing to do with her money or her power. The next morning, the apartment was filled with the sounds and smells of normalcy. Daniel was flipping pancakes on the stove when Evelyn emerged. She had managed to tie her hair back neatly and was still wearing her slightly rumpled corporate clothes, but her face was softer, the lines of tension around her eyes slightly eased. Lily, fully awake and energetic, raced over to hug her. "Did you sleep good, Ms. Eve?" Evelyn nodded, a small, genuine curve forming on her lips. The first true smile Daniel had seen from her. Perhaps the first she had genuinely offered in months. Daniel invited her to breakfast. Simple egg sandwiches, pancakes, and cheap but strongly brewed coffee. Evelyn looked at the humble meal as if it were an extravagant, unfamiliar gift. For a fleeting 20 minutes, they were just three people sharing a table, the corporate chasm invisible in the morning light. After Lily was dropped off at school, Evelyn remained, the files spread out on Daniel's small kitchen table. "What's the next move?" Daniel asked, leaning against the counter. Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I have to prove they manufactured the evidence, Daniel. The papers look authentic. The numbers seem right, but I'm alone. If I walk back in there without a clear counter strategy, they'll have me arrested or locked out." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "No," he said, "you're not alone." Evelyn looked at him, truly looked, for a long, silent moment. She hadn't heard those words spoken honestly. She was a child. They pored over the documents together. Evelyn, brilliant as she was blinded by the magnitude of the betrayal and the sheer complexity of the corporate structure. Daniel, however, saw the documents through a different lens. He pointed to a faint misalignment in the signature block. Then he noticed a critical detail, a minor ledger entry date that was inconsistent with the flow of the account transfers. "Wait," Daniel muttered, squinting at a spreadsheet printout. "The transfer date is listed as the 14th, but the receiving account shows the authorization time-stamped on the 11th, 3 days before the subsidiary even recorded the order. They used a generic template and forgot to align the dates." Evelyn gasped, snatching the papers. It was a clear, fatal inconsistency. How did you spot that?" she demanded, stunned. "I've had external auditors look at this for 10 hours, and they missed it." Daniel gave a slight, wry smile, a genuine human expression. "I used to be an accountant, Miss Carter," he admitted. "A long time ago, before my wife passed and I had to start working 3 jobs to keep the bills paid. Double-entry bookkeeping is like riding a bike." Evelyn stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. Here, the man she employed to fix dripping pipes and malfunctioning air conditioning units was analyzing complex financial fraud with the eye of a veteran. The two people, who seemed to be separated by an insurmountable class divide, suddenly found common ground in shared loss and silent, solitary struggle. "Your wife," Evelyn began, her voice soft. Daniel sat down, his smile fading. He told her the brief, painful story. She had been killed in a car accident when he was 28. He had lost his career, his comfort, and his partner in one terrible instant. "Since then, I've been both the father and the mother," he said simply. "Whatever job kept the lights on and Lily fed, I took it." Evelyn looked down at her hands, which still held Lily's teddy bear. "I've never had anyone to fight alongside me," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Daniel stood up, his gaze intense. "You do now." They spent the next few hours meticulously cross-referencing every number and date in the files, building an undeniable case of forgery. Later that afternoon, they walked into the lobby of Carter Industries. Every employee stopped, watching the disgraced CEO return. Their faces were a mixture of shock, pity, and barely concealed triumph. Evelyn looked like a phoenix, defiant and focused, but Daniel, walking 2 paces behind her, was the wall, silent, ordinary, and utterly unyielding. They headed straight for the executive conference room, where the dissenting faction, smug and confident of Evelyn's imminent collapse, was waiting. A senior board member, Mr. Harrison, smiled a cold, shark-like grin. "Have you come to sign the confession, Evelyn? It's time to move on." Evelyn walked to the center of the table and placed the original, falsified folders down. Then Daniel stepped forward, his cheap work boots making a stark, authoritative sound on the marble floor. He placed the corrected, annotated files beside the originals. "This entire document," Daniel said, his voice clear and unexpectedly strong, "is fabricated, and we have the evidence to prove it." The room went completely silent. They had prepared for Evelyn's corporate lawyer, not the night shift maintenance worker. Daniel proceeded to calmly dismantle their entire case, pointing out the misaligned signature block, the illogical account dates, and the clear signs of digital splicing. One of the men finally found his voice. "Who are you to interrupt a board meeting? You're just a—" Evelyn cut him off, her voice ringing with newfound power and conviction. She stood directly beside Daniel. "He is the only person who stood by me when all of you tried to destroy my life and my career," she declared fiercely. "He is my witness, my advisor, and my protector." There were no more questions. The weight of the undeniable, simple truth crushed their carefully constructed lies. By the end of the evening, the dissenting faction was suspended, pending a full criminal investigation. Evelyn had won, not by using money or power, but by trusting the one person who saw her as a human being. As they walked out of the towering corporate building, Evelyn paused, her eyes wet, but this time not from fear. "Why did you truly trust me, Daniel? Why did you risk your job?" Daniel looked back at the glass skyscraper, then at the bright city lights. "Because I know what it feels like," he said quietly, "to be completely left behind when you needed someone the most." 1 week later, the atmosphere at Carter Industries had fundamentally changed. The cold, impenetrable shell around Evelyn Carter had cracked. She began smiling in the hallways, listening to her managers, and even addressing employees by name. Daniel was formally invited to her office daily to assist with data analysis and security assessments, a temporary consulting role that came with a necessary pay bump. He excelled at the work, but every day, promptly at 4:30 p.m., Daniel would gather his things. "Leaving already, Daniel?" Evelyn once asked, raising an eyebrow from behind her desk. "Yes, Miss Carter," he replied simply. "Lily finishes school at 5:00. I need to be there." Evelyn watched him go, a strange, thoughtful expression on her face. For the first time, she saw a successful, responsible man who was not defined by his work. He was defined by his commitments, and that responsibility, she realized, was more admirable than any management degree. Lily and Evelyn quickly developed a close, genuine bond. Lily often drew bright, crayon pictures for Miss Eve, leaving them taped haphazardly on Daniel's file cabinet. Evelyn kept them. One Tuesday evening, Evelyn unexpectedly appeared at Daniel's small apartment again, ostensibly to drop off a new set of investigation files. But she lingered. She watched Daniel and Lily on the sofa, the little girl curled up against him as he read a worn picture book aloud. The warm yellow light of a single lamp cast an intimate glow on the small room, making it look like a private, perfect sanctuary. A world she had spent her life trying to build, but never found. "What keeps you so strong, Daniel?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with envy. Daniel looked down at his daughter, stroking her hair. "This one," he said. "She's everything." Evelyn lowered her head, a confession escaping her lips. "I have 1,000 employees, millions of dollars, and a whole corporate empire. But I look at you, and I realize I have nothing that truly matters. I want someone to be my everything, too." Daniel remained silent. He understood the profound, aching loneliness in her voice. Evelyn looked around the small space, no longer seeing the outdated furniture, but the sanctuary it represented. She was worth billions, yet she envied this man who made minimum wage. She realized money could only buy insulation from the world, but it couldn't buy this warmth. Daniel watched her, seeing the Ice Queen melt away to reveal a profoundly lonely woman beneath the expensive facade. He felt a deep protective instinct rise in him, something beyond employee loyalty. "It's not the empire, Evelyn," Daniel said, his voice dropping. "It's connection. I lost mine, and I fight to keep hers." He nodded toward Lily's room. "You didn't lose connection. You just never had the chance to build it." He stepped closer, no longer boss and employee, but two equals sharing a moment of painful, beautiful truth. He reached out, hesitating slightly, then gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Evelyn closed her eyes at the simple, unexpected touch. That single, non-material gesture was more profound than any corporate victory she had ever had. "I don't know how to build it," she whispered. Evelyn opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. The warmth of his hand still lingered on her temple. I'm not just talking about a relationship, Daniel. I'm talking about this, she said, gesturing vaguely around the room, feeling it simultaneously small and vast. This quiet understanding. When I run the company, I measure success by market cap and profit. Now I measure it by the peace in this room, by Lily's trust in you, by your willingness to halt your life to help a stranger. That is the real wealth. A deep embarrassment suddenly made her turn away. She realized she had just confessed her deepest desire to him. Daniel felt his own defensive walls crumble. He didn't see the Ice Queen anymore, but a lonely woman who, despite all her power, had never been loved just for who she was. We all need a safe harbor, Evelyn, he replied gently. You gave me a job, but you didn't give me a home. I'm just offering you a temporary refuge, built of cheap plywood and good intentions. He let his hand brush lightly across her cheek for a brief moment, his thumb tracing her soft skin. The air between them thickened, charged with things left unsaid. It was a dangerous, wonderful energy, the first spark of something potentially irreversible. He quickly withdrew his hand, slightly flustered by the intensity of his own reaction. You start by staying for dinner, Daniel muttered, a bit of his old playful personality returning. The intensity broke when Lily, having sensed the quiet, padded back out. The little girl jumped up from the couch and ran over to Evelyn, hugging her leg. She looked up at the two adults, sensing the quiet intensity. Ms. Eve, can you stay and have dinner with me and Daddy tonight? Lily asked, her question innocent and direct. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, a heartfelt, immediate affirmation. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking for an exit. She wanted to stay. A month later, Daniel was officially promoted to a part-time internal data analyst. It was a significant bump in pay and status, but he stubbornly insisted on keeping his night maintenance shift 2 nights a week. He didn't want Lily to think less of manual labor, and he needed the reminder of how far he had come and how quickly life could change. Evelyn had slowly, steadily, and naturally integrated herself into their small unit. She was no longer just his boss. She was a fixture, a friend, and now a kind of extended family. She spent nearly every Saturday afternoon with them, helping Lily with homework or just watching bad TV. One quiet evening, Lily had fallen asleep on Evelyn's shoulder while they watched a movie. Daniel gently took the child into his arms, carrying her to bed and tucking her in. When he returned, his eyes met Evelyn's. The guarded distance was completely gone. Evelyn looked at Daniel, her voice trembling slightly. You know, Daniel, I came to your door that night because I was terrified and desperate. I was running from losing everything. She paused, taking a deep breath. But after the first day, I kept coming back, and I stayed because of you, because of this peace you've built. Daniel didn't speak. Instead, he simply took a step closer to her, closing the last physical gap between them. Evelyn reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and steady this time, not shaking. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes shining. Thank you for saving more than just my career. Daniel gently squeezed her hand. Thank you, Evelyn, he responded softly. Thank you for making me feel like I don't have to fight this life alone anymore. Just then, Lily stirred, shuffling out of the bedroom, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked at the two adults standing close, their hands linked. She tilted her head in confusion for a second, then a wide, innocent smile spread across her face. You're holding hands, she observed cheerfully. Daniel and Evelyn instantly broke out in shared laughter, a sound that was synchronous, easy, and completely new. They were laughing together, in the same rhythm, for the first time. The final scene found them sitting side by side on the living room sofa. Lily nestled between them, looking out at the glittering city lights through the small apartment window. No more words were needed. A new family, forged in a moment of crisis at 2 a.m., had begun. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories.